welcome in to another episode of the Crimson Flame podcast. I am your host, Katie Windham, the assistant editor at Bama Central or Alabama Crimson Tide on SI, and I'm so happy you're here joining me for another week. It was a busy week for Alabama athletics, especially on the women's side, so let's get into last week's rundown. Women's basketball beat Florida State 91 to 71 in a preseason scrimmage in Birmingham. So they'll have one scrimmage left, which we'll get into at the end, but a good start for them, kind of showing where this team is. Coming off a season where you made the NCAA tournament, fell just short of the Sweet 16, but you graduated a lot of those players. Obviously, Sarah Ashley Barker, Aaliyah Nye, Zay Green. So that's kind of a team to watch this year, how they start out the season. Disappointing week for soccer. They lost 3-1 at Arkansas and then lost 1-0 at home against Mississippi State in the home regular season finale. Cross country finished third at the Crimson Classic, their home cross country race last Friday. Cynthia Jamutai won the SEC Freshman of the Week for coming in second place individually in the 6K. So good week for her, good race for the Crimson Tide cross country team. The men's team won on the men's side, and the women's team came in third. For women's tennis, Christina Paskuskas, apologies for the mispronunciation, I'm sure, of her last name, won the ITA Southern Regional Singles title last week, which punched her ticket to the NCAA Singles Championship in November, so she will have an opportunity to compete for an individual national title for the Crimson Tide. Volleyball had a big week. They lost on Friday 3-2 at Georgia in front of a sold out, not even a sold out crowd, in front of over 8,700 fans, which set an attendance record in the state of Georgia for NCAA volleyball. It was a big push for Georgia to have this huge crowd at their match, and Alabama kind of took them to the brink and almost won that game on the road. And then on Sunday, they did sweep South Carolina on the road for their first SEC road win since 2022 and their first road sweep since 2021. So kind of like we talked about last week, a lot of positive momentum for the women's volleyball program under Rashinda Reed. Softball continued fall ball, excuse me, with a doubleheader sweep, 11-2 and 15-0. So lots of offense going on over at Rhodes, which is good to see. The offense is a lot better overall last year, but after some struggles in previous seasons, it's good to see that continuing. And that wraps up the past week in women's athletics for the Crimson Tide. And today it's going to be a little bit different. We don't have a guest this week, and so we'll get into a little bit more of my story. I know in the introduction I gave you a little bit of my background on kind of why I felt qualified to do this, why I wanted to do this podcast focusing on women's athletics. But today I'm going to focus on how I got into sports journalism and then how kind of I got to where I am now in this field. So growing up, like I talked about in the intro episode, I always loved sports, even though I grew up in a house with two sisters, no brothers. Sports were always on at our house. We were always traveling to sporting events. A lot of our vacations revolved around Alabama sports, or we would go on vacations in the summer. We would always go to an MLB game. In Maine, we went to a minor league game, just where sports were big for us. So it was always something I was interested in, always something I was passionate about. And growing up, I loved watching College Game Day on Saturdays. And when I was growing up, it was Erin Andrews that was kind of the main female voice on Game Day. She was their main sideline reporter for ESPN at the time, covering games. And now she's obviously gone on into bigger and better things in her career, doing more NFL stuff these days. But that was kind of who I grew up watching and thought, okay, that's what I want to be one day. And people would always tell me that too growing up, that because they knew how much I liked sports, every Monday coming to school, middle school through high school, which I kind of, in those growing up in the ages of kind of the golden age or the most recent golden age of Alabama football. So obviously most Mondays it was coming in off a win, but we talk about football with my teachers, and so just a lot of people knew it was something I was interested in, knew a lot about, and so a lot of people would say, "Oh, you'll be Erin Andrews when you grow up." So that's kind of what I thought I would do. I came to Alabama majoring in telecommunications and film, TCF at the time is what the major was. So in the College of Communications, TCF and journalism, JN were kind of like the heads for their subjects were two separate majors. But Alabama had gotten the feedback that their TCF graduates did not have enough writing experience and their journalism graduates didn't have enough multimedia video experience, and so they merged the two to make journalism and creative media at JCM, a new major at Alabama heading into my sophomore year. because really so much of journalism is multimedia. So I obviously write for Bama Central, which is a written platform, but I mean, I'm speaking on this podcast right now. I'm videoing it. We do videos after the game. So you do post-game analysis. We do videos throughout the week. So you kind of do have to know how to do a little bit of everything. You have to be able to edit videos, all that kind of stuff. And then the people that work on the TV side, the people that work at your local TV stations, maybe not as much once you get up on network television, but the people who work in local TV, they have to shoot their own packages. So you're writing for that. You're writing, you may be interviewing a subject for your package, but then the intro and outro is something that you've normally kind of written out, or they have to write digital stories for their website that go along with the video stories that they produce. And so you do have to know how to do both. So Alabama's kind of getting ahead of the curve there. So that was entering my sophomore season that they kind of changed the majors. And so because I'd started in TCF, I could stay technically grandfathered into that major. But it just didn't really make sense because I was still early enough in my college career that I wasn't so like entrenched in the curriculum, and all the curriculum would be switching moving forward to JCM classes. So it just made sense. And so I switched to JCM, but in a way, it was kind of like the same major. It basically was. It tweaked things a little bit. And so I don't know if I realized it at the time or thought about it then that my focus would kind of be shifting from more broadcast on air to writing. I don't think that was necessarily my intention. It was just because really all the classes at Alabama you were kind of doing, you had classes that focused on both or on each kind of separate thing, and then you had some classes that focus on both depending on your professor or what the subject of the class was. So really, I was just kind of going through college, enjoying it. I thought about early on in college, thinking about doing Crimson Tide Productions, auditioning for that, which that's kind of the multimedia branch of Alabama athletics. We talked about it with Ariel Schaefer a couple weeks ago on episode 2, I believe. And but that you kind of work your way up. You start doing like literal camera stuff, holding the camera, holding the wires, working in the control room, stuff like that before you get to do on air stuff. And then there's also WVUA on campus, like all those kind of opportunities. And I just never, I don't know, I just didn't, I was enjoying college, like other extracurriculars I was plugged in with, my friend group. And so I enjoyed just going to the sporting event. So I didn't really, my first couple years of college, I didn't get any experience, which I would not necessarily recommend, but that was just kind of how it played out for me. And then going into my senior year, I kind of realized, maybe I should get some internships, get some real world experience. And so that was back when, in order to intern at the Tuscaloosa News, it had to be through UA, and you got class credit because they didn't want to have to pay you. And that's how most sports media internships are. I think now it's a little bit better, and I think it's gotten to where more of them maybe do pay you, but back then that was not the case. And so going into my senior year, I'd applied for an internship at the Tuscaloosa News to be there that summer and that fall. And then I'd also applied for an internship to work at WSFA in Montgomery, which is where I'm from, that summer. And I ended up getting that, and it was going to be more on the digital side. So I was at a TV station, but it was on the digital side, so for their website. So every local TV station also has a website they post stories on. A lot of them have huge Facebook pages that they'll post the stories on, and they get a lot of clicks and ad revenues from things like that. And so that summer I interned at WSFA, got to experience being in an actual TV newsroom, getting to hear their budget meetings every day, their rundowns for what was going to be what needed to go on the noon broadcast, what needed to go in the 4 o'clock broadcast, what they were saving for the night, that kind of stuff. I got to shadow the sports reporters at the time, kind of when they would go out and do stuff. The thing is, summer is not obviously the best time for sports in a smaller market like Montgomery. Montgomery's kind of, I guess, technically medium sized, but there's no pro teams there, so there's no MLB baseball. There is minor league baseball, but there's not as much going on. But when there was, I got to go shadow and kind of see some of what they do, which was cool. I got to write a lot of stories for their website. I would not recommend going and looking them up and trying to read what I wrote that summer. I'm sure they're still out there on the internet, but I'm not sure how good they are. Even though I do think all those stories, I think, were edited before they went up. So maybe they're not horrible, but that was kind of what I did that summer. And then I had applied for the Tuscaloosa News internship. And when you did that, you ranked like what areas you wanted to work in: sports, news, copy editing, that kind of stuff. That was back when the Tuscaloosa News had an operational newsroom where when they printed the actual paper in Tuscaloosa at the building, which now doesn't even exist and it's being turned into the Saban Center, but that's a whole other thing. And so that fall, I got to intern in sports, at the Tuscaloosa News, and they told us at the beginning of the semester, I think there's probably about six of us, that we would each get to cover two Alabama football games as an intern. And then they assigned us like different beats of like more minor sports that would be easier to get students access to. So I covered some Alabama volleyball games for them. Cross country was my beat. So I would go to high schools around the area and kind of do features on cross country. And then also a big part of our role was every Friday night covering high school football all around the Tuscaloosa County, Pickens County, Bibb County, the area, not just the city of Tuscaloosa, kind of the whole area. So Friday nights, my senior year, when my friends are out doing stuff, I would be in Pickens County or wherever. But that was a really good experience. High school football, if you can cover that, you can cover almost anything because you don't think about it, but covering an Alabama game, you have stat broadcast pulled up, you can have ESPN pulled up, you're in the press box with the TV on, like you have access to so many stats, replays, Twitter, where you can see everything. High school, if you're looking down, if you're not looking up at a play, like you missed it. Like, and there's no, some schools, obviously the schools are keeping their own stats, but that's not always shared with the people that are there covering the game. So you have to keep your own stats. You have to go track down who you want to interview after the game. There's not a press conference set up. A lot of times you're supposed to go to the winning team, but if the winning team's not in your region, then you have to go track down a coach that just lost and he could have gotten his butt kicked and he does not want to talk to a little college kid about his team getting beat so bad. So it's a lot of you have to get outside of your shell, and I'm more an introverted person, and you just have to go do that kind of stuff. You have to keep your own stats. You have to turn around a story quickly, especially back in the day when they were still printing the paper at night. So you literally had to get it in by a set deadline. So that was a great experience for me. The first game I ever covered, because they're probably thinking, which like this is just how it works. This is like no shade. I don't have a ton of experience, so they sent me to Tuscaloosa Academy, who at the time was AISA. So now they are AHSAA, so they're part of the regular Alabama High School Football Association. They were part of the Independent School Association, which is a lot smaller schools, a lot smaller teams. I honestly couldn't even tell you now who they played, but I do remember it's the first game I'm covering, first high school game I'm covering. The opposing team shows up late. The game doesn't start on time. It's supposed to start at 7. They had a flat tire. The opposing team did, and they ended up losing pretty bad. So my lead was kind of something creative about, you know, their flat tire, the bus. It was kind of symbolic for the night that was to come, and it was a good lead. In which, I honestly am not normally super great or creative with leads, but it was good at the time. It caught the eye of the editor, who at the time was Edwin Stanton. Caught the eye of Cecil Hurt, who was obviously the legendary Tuscaloosa News columnist, who was there at the time, and they were impressed with what I was able to do with that story. Kind of started assigning me to a little bigger high school games, and because of that they put me in contact with John Zener at the AP, and so I became a stringer for the AP for Alabama football games. So what did that mean? That was I would go, John Zener, who worked for the Associated Press in the state of Alabama for a really long time, he just recently retired this past year. He would be writing the game story for the AP that would go out on the AP wire. So that game story would be on the ESPN app. It would be in newspapers all across the country because, for like example, a newspaper in Seattle that just needs to fill a story in their sports section. If Alabama had a big top 25, top 10 game, whatever, then that game stories can be in there. Anyway, so he's the one writing the game story. My job was to go to the visiting post-game press conference and get quotes for him because he can only be in one place at once. And this was pre-COVID, pre-Zoom press conferences. This is when you had to be there in person in order to get the quotes. Obviously, most of the time stuff is put up on YouTube later, but when you're kind of trying to get stuff out fast. So anyway, that was my job is I would go to the post game for the visiting team and I would get quotes from the coach, from some of the players, and send them to him for stories if he needed a specific angle. Which honestly, thinking back on it and kind of knowing how things work now with who SIDs will call on, it's honestly a miracle like I ever got called on in some of these post games that I was just some random college girl that the visiting ADs, not ADs, SIDs would call on me sometimes. It's funny, but that was fun. That was good experience getting to see how kind of other beats worked around the SEC, getting to be around other SEC coaches, hearing how those press conferences worked, learning how to get stuff turned around quickly, except all I was doing was transcribing, which is a huge part of post-game coverage, but it was nice because then I wasn't working super long after games like I am now. I would just have to transcribe the quotes and then I would send them to John Zener. And so then, because of that, because I was a stringer, because of that, he had me start covering basketball games for the AP, which that was Nate's first season in 2019. His very first game. It's the first game I'm covering for the AP. I'm doing the gamer because Zener covered the whole state of Alabama, so he covered Alabama, Auburn, any other top 25 team in the state, and he lived in Montgomery, so he wouldn't come up to Tuscaloosa for every basketball game, especially if it wasn't a top 25 matchup. So Alabama's first game is against Penn. I'm covering the gamer. Then with the AP back then, it's a little different now. But you would have to file your initial story 10 to 15 minutes after the game ended, and then you would go to the post game press conference, get quotes, update the story, send it back off to another editor, and then they would kind of edit it again. But that's stressful. That's one of the hardest things for a young writer of any time it still is today for interns I see a lot is getting stuff out quickly because you're used in college to having all the time in the world to do your assignments. You can procrastinate, wait till the last minute to do an essay, but you generally have time. But in journalism, the whole thing is getting stuff out quickly. And I think you're so used to school editing stuff, wanting to get it perfect before you send it out, but that's just not realistic in the real world. So I'm stressed. I'm nervous about doing my first AP game story, and Alabama loses. I think by one point, Kyra Lewis was at the free throw line at the end with the opportunity to win and couldn't do it. And so they lose to Penn. It's NATO's first game. I'm stressed. I got to get this story out. And I do. And then that just became a thing. I covered a bunch of basketball games for the AP that year. And that was my senior year of college. That continued into the spring a little bit because obviously basketball carries over between both semesters, winter and spring. And then that spring, because I had interned at the Tuscaloosa News and done some work for the AP, I was approached by the then editor and assistant sports editor and assistant sports editor for the Crimson White, which is a student paper at Alabama, about covering Alabama gymnastics because some of the people that worked at the CW had interned with me at the Tuscaloosa News, and I'd covered gymnastics for a class the year before, so they knew I had some experience with gymnastics. I knew about the sport. And so they approached me. It was going to be a staff position. It was going to be a paid position. I was like, wow, like going to get paid to do journalism. This is awesome, which I did get paid to do stuff for the AP too. But I was like, yeah, sure. Gymnastics is a fun sport to cover. It's only once a week. It's pretty easy. So I covered gymnastics that spring for the CW. And then that was when COVID happened in March of 2020. And so that season ended early. And my journalism career seemingly ended at that time as well. So I had gotten some really good experience with at WSFA, working at the TV station, working with the Tuscaloosa News, a true newspaper, working for the AP, one of the biggest organizations in the world, learning how to get out stories quickly, concisely, learning to tell kind of an unbiased both sides of the story. Because when you work for a team site and are covering one specific team, your focus is kind of you still have to be unbiased, but your lens is kind of always going to be through the team you cover. But when it's the AP, it kind of has to be a fair and balanced story. So a- anyway, I got good experience doing that. And then good experience for the CW, the student paper, getting to cover a sport like gymnastics. And then I graduated, I got my degree, but didn't get to walk across the stage at the time because it was during COVID. And then I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. Did I want to go into journalism full time? Did I want to do something else? I had already gotten accepted to Alabama to get my master's in sports management hospitality, so I was going to be doing that the upcoming fall and spring, but it would be all online because of COVID. So that fall of 2020, I did not do any journalism work at all. I didn't freelance for anyone. I didn't work for anyone. I just enjoyed being a grad student, and it was a good student. It was a good year to be a student, and obviously football went undefeated. Got to go to all the home games, got to go to all the postseason games. It was fun. And then, I'm not sure if it was that December or January, I'd gotten contacted by Tyler Martin, who used to work for Bama Central, who I had worked with, I think at Tuscaloosa News and maybe the CW too. And that his boss, Christopher Walsh, who is now my boss, still at Bama Central, was interested in me covering Alabama gymnastics for them and maybe some softball too. And so that was spring of 2021. I thought, why not? It's a good opportunity to get back into business a little bit, see if it's something I still want to do. I enjoy covering both those teams. Um, and I think actually originally at the time it was just supposed to be gymnastics, and then it ended up being softball too. And that really led into gymnastics that season. Won the SEC championship softball that season won the SEC championship, SEC tournament. I got to be at both of those things. I actually wasn't at the title game, SEC title game for the SEC softball tournament because I had a wedding shower to go to that day, but I was there for the rest of the tournament and for most of the regular season home games. And then because of that, just because of the work I did doing that, I was offered a job, a full-time job by Chris, and I've been here ever since. So really ever since, if you go back to when I originally applied for the jobs with the internships with WSFA and Tuscaloosa News, I haven't had to apply for a job or internship since then. And I know I'm very fortunate in that. And I think you hear the phrase, it's not about the grades you make, but the hands you shake. And I think that's very true in sports journalism. It is about the people you know, but it's also about the type of work you do and how hard of a worker you are that I was able to get recommended to other people, that other people were interested in me working for them because of the type of work I produced. And so yeah, the doors kind of opened up for me, but my recommendation to anyone out there that's listening that may be interested in sports journalism would be uh, to go out and get internships, to get experience in the field is something you can't replicate. Having to turn around a story quickly, having to interview somebody, go cover some of the smaller sports, some of these sports that we talk about on this podcast that don't get as much media attention. Go try and find a good feature to do there. Go to their press conference, ask questions. It's a lot lower stakes than watching or than trying to ask a question to Kalen DeBoer that's going to be viewed by hundreds of thousands of people or listened to on the radio. So it's a good opportunity to learn those skills. So I'd recommend go out there, get the experience, make connections, smile, be kind to people, leave a good impression on people. Don't be closed off. Don't be, it can be intimidating to walk into any beat, but being friendly, I think, goes a long way and it's really important. So I think I have kind of a unique career path in some ways, but then others, it's just kind of how journalism, sports journalism works is knowing the right people, doing a good job, and working hard. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got to where I am today. And if you have any questions, if you uh, have any questions about where you should intern or internship opportunities, uh, I don't know. I'm not in charge of that here for us at Bama Central, but a lot of times we are looking for good quality interns, and there's lots of places around Tuscaloosa, around the state that will provide good opportunities to do that kind of stuff. Just get your name out there, get stuff written, published online, that kind of stuff. So that's just a little bit of my journey, how I got to where I am. And a lot of it came because of covering women's sports, by covering that volleyball for the Tuscaloosa News or covering gymnastics for the CW and then covering gymnastics and softball for Chris here at Bama Central. And then that led to him offering me a full-time job, which led to me now being able to cover football and men's basketball and softball and gymnastics. So I still kind of have those original sports, but then also get to cover the bigger things too and get to go to college football playoffs and NCAA tournaments and all that kind of fun stuff. The really cool stuff that comes along with getting to cover Alabama in my, let's see, I would have started full time in July of 2021. So about in my 4.5 years on the beat, I've gotten to cover multiple college football playoffs, the Final Four, multiple Women's College World Series, like I said, an SEC championship in gymnastics. Just lots of fun and cool stuff that I'm very blessed and very grateful to get to do. But yeah, that's a little bit of my story, and and now we'll transition into the upcoming week in women's athletics at Alabama. Women's golf will be playing at the Landfall Tradition in Wilmington, North Carolina, Friday through Sunday, so all weekend long. Also on Friday, volleyball will host number 16 Tennessee at 6 p.m. Gymnastics hosts the Ghosts and Goblins inter squad from 6 to 8. I think the doors open at 5:30. It will be down in their practice facility in the bottom of Coleman. You can go check out last week's episode with head coach Ashley Johnson talking a little bit more about the event and kind of overall what's coming up with the program and Alabama Gymnastics. They had some tough news this week with Karis German sharing on her Instagram that she suffered a season-ending injury, but she will still be there all season long supporting her team. So if you want to get your first glance of Alabama Gymnastics this season and a fun family event, go out and check out Ghosts and Goblins this Friday night in the bottom of Coleman. On Saturday, softball continues their fall ball with a doubleheader. And then that's it for Saturday for women's sports. There's a lot going on Sunday. Softball has fall ball versus Mercer at 1:30. And then there's three different things going on at 2 p.m. Volleyball hosts number three, Kentucky. Soccer closes out the regular season at Tennessee at 2 p.m. And then women's basketball has their final preseason tune-up versus West Florida at 2 p.m. inside Coleman Coliseum. And that kind of leads into next week where we will hopefully have Alabama women's basketball head coach Christy Curry on the show. I'm supposed to talk to her next week. You never know, especially this close to the season, how busy her schedule might be. But if not next week, it will be coming up shortly. So that's exciting. So be sure to tune in next week. Keep up with all of our coverage on Bama Central, on Alabama Crimson Tide, on SI. This weekend, I will be in Columbia for the football game for South Carolina, along with Hunter DeCiver and Joe Gaither. Make sure you check out Joe Gaither's show, The Joe Gaither Show, on Bama Central. His podcast comes out each weekday, focusing on Alabama football mainly, but lots of fun stuff with him and his co-host Mason Woods and some of the guests they have each and every week. But that'll about wrap it up for this week's episode. Thank you for listening or watching wherever you prefer to do so. Share it with your friends, leave a review, subscribe, all that kind of fun stuff, and I will see you next week.